The shed exploded at exactly 2:13 a.m., and I know that because my security camera caught the whole thing in crystal clear night vision. 1 second it was their minutely painted, regulation-compliant backyard storage shed, and the next, it was a tower of flames lighting up the night like a 4th of July firework gone rogue. And standing right there in the glow, lighter still in hand and stupidly not realizing she was on camera, was Francine Stokely, our HOA president, queen of petty rules, and the single most unhinged woman I've ever had the misfortune of living near. My name's Quaid Norwell. I'm a machinist by trade, a bit of a loner, and I keep to myself in the house my dad left me. I've been in this neighborhood for 8 years. Never made trouble. Never threw loud parties. I mow my lawn. I pay my dues. But Francine? She's been gunning for me since the day she got voted onto the HOA board 3 years ago. She swears my shed was an eyesore, even though it was built to spec, painted to match my house, and sat well within the property line. But this was criminal. Literal arson. And I had it all on tape. Let me back up a bit. 2 weeks before the incident, she'd inspected my backyard while I was at work. Yeah, trespassed. Left a note taped to my back door saying the shed did not conform with neighborhood standards. I checked the HOA guidelines. My shed was exactly within regulation. I even called the city office to double-check my permits. All green. I sent Francine the documentation. Her response? A hand-delivered warning letter from the HOA board threatening daily fines until I removed the non-compliant structure. I refused. Next day, she called in a noise complaint on me. I wasn't even home. The day after that, I found my trash dumped across my driveway. Childish nonsense. But I didn't react. I just documented everything, logged times, took photos, and kept adding to the folder I'd started the day she dropped off that first warning. The night of the fire, I was in my garage tuning up my old Harley. I heard the whoosh before I saw the glow. By the time I got to the backyard, the shed was fully engulfed. My garden hose was a joke against the flames. Fire department came quick, but it was already toast. They ruled it suspicious and asked who had access to my yard. I handed them a USB stick with the footage. Wait, the firefighter said, squinting at the screen. Is that? Yep, I said. That's her. Francine Stokely, HOA president. And I didn't stop there. The next morning, I printed out still shots from the footage and dropped off a copy at every mailbox on the block. By noon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Francine tried to claim the footage was doctored. But my neighbor, Dale, an ex-cop, shut that down fast. I've seen plenty of doctored footage, he told the crowd that gathered outside her house. This ain't it. That's you holding the lighter, Francine. She slammed her door. But the damage was done. I filed a police report and gave them everything: video, timestamps, the printed threats from the HOA, even the voicemail she left me last week saying, that ugly shed will be gone one way or another. 3 days later, Francine was arrested for arson and trespassing. She was screaming about neighborhood integrity as they cuffed her on her front lawn. But I wasn't finished. I sent a formal invoice to the HOA certified mail, return receipt. It included the full cost of the shed, installation, permit fees, contents lost in the fire, and a healthy bill for emotional distress. Totaled just under $28,000. They ignored it. So I sued them. Not just Francine, but the entire HOA board. Because here's the thing. They knew what she was doing. I had emails from other board members replying to her threats with things like, do what you have to and we'll back you. They enabled her, encouraged her, and now they were going to pay for it. Their lawyer tried to get the case dismissed. Didn't happen. The judge took one look at the evidence and set a hearing date. And while all of this was going down, the neighborhood started to turn. People who'd once cowered under the HOA's constant fines and threats started speaking up. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd targeted. A retired couple down the street had been fined for having unauthorized flowers in their front yard. A single mom had received threats over her kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. One guy even got fined for the color of his bird feeder. They started showing up at city council meetings, talking to local news. Francine's arrest had cracked the dam wide open, and the flood was coming. But me? I was focused. I had one goal: make them pay. Every last dime. The morning after Francine's arrest, a uniformed officer knocked on my door just as I was tightening a new chain on the Harley. He was young, clipped, and had that stiff posture that said this wasn't a neighborly visit. "You Quaid Norwell?" he asked, flipping through a notepad. "That's me. I'm Officer Latham, assigned to the ongoing investigation. We've got a few questions about the property damage and any communications you may have received from the HOA prior to the fire." He stepped inside when I waved him in, eyes scanning the interior like he was mentally photographing everything. I led him into the kitchen where I had a manila folder already waiting on the counter. Inside were copies of the certified letters, the HOA's enforcement warnings, and the color printouts of their email exchanges, the ones I'd obtained through a neighbor who worked in IT and had helped a few residents recover deleted messages from their email servers. Apparently, Francine wasn't tech-savvy enough to realize delete didn't mean gone forever. Latham flipped through the pages and stopped on a printed email from board member Craig Templeton. He pointed at the line, "If he won't comply, let's escalate. We've covered you before. We'll do it again." "Mind explaining this?" he asked without looking up. "Explains itself, doesn't it? That's a premeditated conspiracy. They knew she was going to do something and gave her a green light." Latham nodded, lips tightening. "That's not just HOA overreach. That crosses into criminal conspiracy. We're forwarding this to the district attorney." I nodded. "You should talk to the Weatherlys 2 blocks down. Their mailbox got ripped off the post when they appealed a fine. They filed a report, but it disappeared from the precinct system. They've got a printed copy."
He jotted that down, then paused.
"We'll need you to testify." Already planned on it. After he left, I walked out onto my front porch. Across the street, a few neighbors were clustered together, murmuring as they watched the tow truck hook up Francine's powder blue Lexus. Her house was quiet now, curtains drawn. No HOA flyers on her porch. Just silence, and that car being hauled off with the same care you'd give a dead appliance. 2 days later, I got a notice from the HOA's interim vice president, Linda Park. She was Francine's second in command and had a reputation for passive-aggressively enforcing rules by pretending to help you comply. The letter was professionally typed, signed in blue ink, and riddled with legal buzzwords. It claimed that because Francine had acted outside the scope of her duties, the HOA was not liable for her personal actions, and therefore I was not entitled to restitution from association funds. I took one look at it, walked back inside, and called my attorney. "Linda's trying to cut the HOA loose from liability," I told him. He chuckled. "Typical. But the email chain you sent me already ties them in. That's collusion, Quaid. If they backed her before, and there's written proof, they're on the hook." "What's the next move?" "I'm filing a motion to freeze their operating account while we pursue damages. If they try to drain it to avoid paying you, we'll have a court order in place." By the following week, the story had picked up traction. Local news crews were camped out 2 blocks down, doing man-on-the-street interviews with residents. One of them, a freelance journalist named Tasha, stopped by my place. She wasn't pushy, just curious. "I'm working on a story about small-town HOA abuse," she said, holding up her press pass. "I've already talked with 3 other homeowners who've had issues with this board. But yours is the only one that ended in fire." I laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. "Yeah, well, some people talk about getting even. Francine just went straight to arson." She raised an eyebrow. "Do they have enough to charge her with intent?" "Oh, they've got more than enough. Surveillance footage, threats, emails. And she bought the lighter fluid with her own HOA-issued debit card. It's all in the reports. That part had come out the day before, in a follow-up visit from Officer Latham. Turned out Francine had used the HOA's discretionary fund to buy supplies she later used to commit the crime. That meant misappropriation of funds, in addition to arson and criminal conspiracy. Tasha's jaw had actually dropped when I told her that. "You know this is going to blow up, right?" she said. "Once your case goes to court, half the state's going to be watching."
"Good," I said.
It's time people saw what really happens when you give unchecked power to the wrong people. Later that evening, I got a call from my attorney. He sounded almost gleeful. "Quaid, you're gonna love this. The DA just expanded the case. They're now investigating the entire HOA board for mismanagement of funds, fraudulent fines, and civil rights violations." I leaned back in my chair, letting that sink in. They're hauling them in? Already started. They served Templeton this morning. Linda got a summons for her deposition tomorrow. I've got your court date set for 3 weeks from now. And, oh, one more thing. They're opening a civil suit on behalf of the neighborhood. You started something big. The next morning, I woke up to find 4 lawn chairs arranged in a circle on my front lawn. Sitting in them were the Weatherlys, Dale from down the street, and a guy I only vaguely recognized, Ben, who ran a landscaping business and had once been fined for parking his trailer on his own driveway. "You hosting a town hall on my grass?" I asked, coffee in hand. "We're forming a neighborhood committee," Dale said. "Not the HOA. Something better. We want actual transparency. Monthly meetings, open books, rotating leadership. No more fines for nonsense. You in?" "I'm in," I said immediately. "But we need bylaws. Real ones. Not that garbage they were using." "We've got a retired paralegal living 2 blocks over," said Ben. She offered to help draft them. I looked at the faces around me. People who'd been too scared to speak up 6 months ago were now planning how to take back their community. "Let's do it right," I said. "No more backroom votes. No more threats. No more Francines." That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA's legal rep. It was an aggressive cease and desist, threatening counter-litigation if I didn't drop my civil suit. I forwarded it to my attorney, who responded with 3 words: "Let them try." That night, Linda Park resigned. She didn't say a word to anyone, just packed up and left in the middle of the night. Her porch light still burned the next morning, a single bulb swinging in the wind, illuminating an empty rocking chair. By the time the first court date rolled around, the courtroom was packed. Not just with lawyers and defendants, but residents from the neighborhood. They sat behind me in rows, their presence a silent statement. Francine didn't look at me when they brought her in. She wore a gray pantsuit and an expression like a cracked porcelain doll frozen, but visibly unraveling. Her attorney tried to argue diminished capacity. The judge shut that down fast. My attorney presented everything. The footage, the emails, the ledger showing misuse of HOA funds, the false fines, the threats. Then he dropped the final piece, a forensic audit revealing that over $70,000 had been siphoned into miscellaneous expenditures under Francine's signature. The judge looked like he wanted to throw the gavel through the bench. "We'll be pursuing restitution," he said, glaring over his glasses. "And I'm referring this for criminal prosecution." As we walked out of the courtroom, Dale clapped me on the shoulder. "You didn't just win a case," he said. "You blew the whole damn system wide open." I nodded, the weight of it finally starting to settle. And I wasn't done yet. There were still bylaws to write, elections to organize, and a community to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we had a fighting chance. The first thing I did after the preliminary hearing was replace my mailbox. Not because it was broken, but because it was one Francine had always hated, a brushed steel model with an etched eagle on the side. She claimed it was too aggressive for the community aesthetic. So I ordered the exact same one, only twice as big, and bolted it down with concrete reinforced footings. Symbolic, maybe. But after everything, I figured I'd earned a little symbolism. The neighborhood was changing fast. In the weeks following the court session, 3 more board members resigned. Not because they were indicted, at least, not yet, but because the scrutiny was mounting. The local paper ran a front-page story titled "Burning Down the Board," and it didn't pull punches. Quotes from residents. Photos of Francine being escorted out in cuffs. A full breakdown of the financial misconduct. The damage was done. No HOA newsletter could bury it. I wasn't on the committee we'd formed, didn't want to be, but I sat in on their first meeting. It was held in Ben's driveway, folding chairs in a loose circle, no podiums or titles. Just neighbors talking like equals. Marcia, the retired paralegal, laid out a sample community charter with clear limits on authority, open vote requirements, and a ban on financial penalties without a third-party mediator. "We're not trying to run people's lives," she said, flipping through pages. "We're just making sure no one else gets to." There were nods all around, and nobody interrupted. That alone told me we were on the right track. But the deeper the investigation went, the darker things got. Officer Latham returned 2 weeks later, this time with a different tone. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, and he carried a larger folder than before. "We're opening a new case," he said, stepping into my living room. "This one's not just about arson or abuse of position.
It's
bigger." He set the folder down and opened it. Inside were scanned bank statements, photocopied receipts, and a printed spreadsheet that made my stomach drop. Over the past 5 years, the HOA collected nearly $200,000 in fines and maintenance fees. Most of that never reached the association's official account. I leaned in. Where'd it go? Private account under Francine's name, and another under Craig Templeton's. They'd been funneling money out through fake landscaping invoices and consulting fees. He handed me a copy of a check. It was made out to Civic Solutions LLC, a company I'd never heard of. "Registered to a P.O. box in another county," Latham said. "No website, no employees, just a shell." We traced it back. Guess who signed the lease on the box? Craig.
right.
We're looking at wire fraud, embezzlement, maybe even racketeering if we can prove it was organized between multiple parties. I let out a low breath. So it wasn't just about power. It was money. Always is. He packed up the folder again. "We'll need you to testify again, this time for the grand jury. You're the one who cracked this open. They're going to want to hear from you directly." I nodded. "I'll be there." That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer and watched the embers in my fire pit. Where my shed had once stood was an empty patch of dirt, still charred at the edges. I hadn't rebuilt it, yet hadn't even cleaned it up. Part of me wanted to leave it as a reminder, not of what had been lost, but of what had been exposed. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a flat voice identified itself as Assistant District Attorney Carla Vance. "I've been assigned to the HOA investigation," she said. "We're preparing charges against the remaining board members. I'd like to meet with you in person." She showed up the following afternoon in a government-issue sedan with a laptop bag slung over one shoulder and an expression like she'd walked out of a courtroom and into a war zone.
She didn't waste time.
"I've reviewed your footage, your documentation, the timeline you submitted. It's meticulous."
"Thanks," I said.
"Didn't plan for it to turn into a criminal case, but here we are." She nodded. "We've confirmed that a total of 6 homeowners were overcharged or falsely fined. 3 of them had liens placed on their properties without proper legal grounds. That's mortgage fraud." I blinked. "They actually filed liens?"
"Yes."
"And 2 were nearly forced into foreclosure. We've subpoenaed the title company that processed them. Turns out they were working with a notary who was less than thorough." She opened her laptop and slid it across the table. On screen was a scanned lean form with an obviously forged signature.
Mine.
They tried to file one against you too. It never made it through because the city clerk flagged the signature. But the intent was there.
I stared at it.
My name. My forged signature. My property under threat. They were planning to take my house. She nodded. We're filing charges for attempted real estate fraud. That's a felony. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all suddenly pressing down hard. What started as a petty power trip had spiraled into full-blown criminal enterprise. Can I ask you something? I said, voice quieter now. How common is this? She closed the laptop. More than you think. HOAs aren't regulated like public agencies. Some of them become little kingdoms. And when no one pushes back, the wrong people get comfortable. A week later, I testified before the grand jury. It wasn't dramatic, no courtroom theatrics, no cross-examinations. Just me, a panel of 12, and the truth. I told them what Francine had done, what the board enabled, what they tried to take. When I finished, one of the jurors, an older man with deep lines around his eyes, asked quietly, "Why didn't you just move?" "Because my dad built that house," I said. "And no one gets to burn it down except time." They indicted Craig and 2 others within 48 hours. Arrested them quietly, no media circus this time. But the news spread fast. Civic Solutions, LLC, was dissolved by court order. The notary who had signed the forged liens lost her license and was facing separate charges. Francine's trial date was set, and her lawyer was already hinting at a plea deal. Meanwhile, our neighborhood charter passed by unanimous vote. No more fines without third-party arbitration. All finances posted publicly every quarter. Leadership rotated annually, and no one could serve more than 2 terms. The burned patch in my yard eventually got cleared out. Ben and Dale helped me pour concrete for a new foundation. This time, I built the shed from scratch, plank by plank. Not because I needed it, I had room in the garage, but because it was mine. And it was staying. One evening, while I was brushing the last coat of stain onto the new siding, Marcia stopped by. She handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Settlement offer. From what's left of the HOA's insurance fund. They folded under pressure and agreed to pay out before the civil trial." I opened it. The number was more than I expected. More than I needed. "You're not taking it?" she asked. "Oh, I'm taking it," I said. "I'm just surprised they had anything left to give." She sat on the porch rail and looked out across the street. "You know, I used to be scared of Francine. Isn't that ridiculous? A 70-year-old woman afraid to plant tomatoes because someone might report it." "Not ridiculous," I said. "Just human." We sat in silence for a while. Kids were playing down the block. Someone was grilling. Normal sounds. Real peace. "So what now?" she asked. "I think I'll finally fix that fence," I said. "Not worried about the new board fining you for the paint color?" I looked up at the fresh shed, gleaming under the porch light. "Let them try." The grand jury indictments were only the beginning. Once the charges were made public, a city audit team swept in like hawks. They started with the HOA's bank records but quickly moved on to physical files, ledgers, meeting minutes, even handwritten notes stored in a dusty cabinet in the clubhouse. The clubhouse hadn't been used for anything but HOA board meetings and the occasional bake sale, but apparently it was also where Francine stored her unofficial paperwork, a black binder labeled compliance measures in gold permanent marker. The contents were far from innocent. Inside were pages of typed lists, residents' names, addresses, and what Francine had labeled behavioral flags. Notes like "doesn't prune shrubs to regulation height," "kids leave bikes on driveway," and "overheard criticizing board policy." It read like a paranoid surveillance log, meticulously dated, color-coded, and full of petty vendettas disguised as community management. At the back were photocopies of checks, all labeled discretionary reimbursements, none of which matched any official expense reports. When the audit team handed their findings over to the district attorney's office, they triggered a second round of charges: malicious prosecution, mail fraud, and, most disturbingly, unlawful surveillance. Francine had been tracking residents without their knowledge and, in a few cases, had even paid a third-party consultant to take photos of certain backyards from alleys and over fences. The consultant turned out to be a former private investigator whose license had expired 2 years ago. I found all this out from Carla Vance, the assistant DA, who called me back in for a follow-up deposition. She arrived at my house late in the afternoon, carrying a sealed evidence bag and a look that was more exhausted than stern. "We've uncovered something bigger," she said, sitting at my kitchen table and sliding the bag across to me. Inside was a small black USB stick. "What's on it?" I asked, not touching it. "Security footage from Francine's house. Internal cameras." One of the techs found it while imaging her personal devices. She had a full setup: living room, office, even one trained on her back patio. "What's relevant to you is what she recorded the day before the fire." I raised an eyebrow. "She filmed herself planning arson?" "No," Carla said. "She filmed a board meeting. A private one. In her home, not the clubhouse. Just her, Craig Templeton, and the HOA's former treasurer, Megan Laird. They were going over a spreadsheet showing projected compliance revenue by lot number." She flipped open a binder and turned it to a printed screen cap from the video. My address was highlighted in yellow. She says, and I quote, "If this one doesn't remove that shed, we can escalate. Make it look like vandalism. The insurance policy can absorb it." My hand clenched around the edge of the table. "You're telling me they plan to torch it and pass it off as a random act?" "That was the plan. And that makes it conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. We're adding that to the charges." The trial date was set for early spring. Francine had refused all plea deals, even after her lawyer's repeated warnings. Craig tried to feign ignorance during his first arraignment, but the video footage made that impossible. Megan Laird was the first to flip. She took a deal in exchange for full cooperation and provided detailed testimony about the board's internal discussions, including a time they debated whether to fine a woman for drying laundry on a clothesline, something they'd previously claimed was unsightly and devaluing to neighboring properties. The community's new charter committee had already passed its first set of reforms, and Marcia, the retired paralegal, had filed the paperwork to dissolve the old HOA's legal entity entirely. It wasn't just symbolic, it was a complete legal restructuring. The association's new form couldn't collect fines, only dues for shared maintenance, and even those had to be approved by a supermajority vote. But while the legal gears turned, I finally took time to rebuild what Francine destroyed. The new shed was solid cedar, with reinforced framing and a metal roof. I added solar lighting, a motion sensor camera on each side, and a hidden fire suppression system I rigged together from salvaged parts. It was overkill, sure, but it made a point. Nothing was going to get torched again. One afternoon, while I was fitting the last of the shelves inside, Dale stopped by. He was carrying a folded lawn chair and one of those oversized thermoses that looked like it belonged on a construction site. "You missed the meeting," he said, settling next to the shed. "Had something better to do," I said, tapping the cedar wall. "What did I miss?" Ben's wife suggested turning the old clubhouse into a community tool library. Donate equipment, share stuff. No more unauthorized tool storage fines. I laughed. "That's actually a good idea."
Yeah.
And get this, one of the new committee members is a high school civics teacher. She's drafting a curriculum based on everything that happened here. Wants to teach kids about local governance, rights, and how to spot abuse of power. Using us as a case study? Pretty much. We sat in silence for a bit, listening to the sound of kids playing a few houses down. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and grilled chicken. No sirens. No flaming sheds. Just normal life. You planning to speak at the trial? Dale asked. I'll do what they need me to do, I said. But I'm not looking for revenge anymore. Just closure. He nodded and took a long sip from his thermos. You've got it, whether you know it or not. The trial lasted 6 days. Francine's defense was a disaster. She tried to argue that her actions were preventative, that the shed posed a fire hazard and she'd merely acted in the interest of community preservation. The prosecution countered with video, financial records, and the damning binder of compliance measures. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict her on all counts: arson, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, unlawful surveillance, and criminal mismanagement of a nonprofit. She was sentenced to 12 years with no chance of parole for at least 6. Craig got 8. Megan, having cooperated, got probation and community service. The former notary who'd signed off on the fake liens lost her license permanently and was fined heavily. After the verdict, Carla found me outside the courthouse. You did more than hold them accountable, she said. You set a precedent. This case is going to be cited in HOA reform legislation across the state. I didn't mean to start a movement, I said. Maybe not. But you sure as hell finished one. The last piece of fallout came a month later when a check arrived in the mail from the HOA's former insurance carrier. It was the final payout from the civil suit, enough to recoup every dollar I'd spent, and then some. I didn't need all of it, so I donated part of it to the new community education fund Marcia had started. They were planning to host workshops on legal literacy, tenant rights, and local governance. The rest I used to build a second structure behind the shed. This one, a small open-air workspace with a sloped roof and a sturdy workbench. A place to tinker, build, repair. The kind of space my dad would have loved. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the lawn, I stood at the edge of the yard and looked out at the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk without anyone threatening fines for unsupervised play. A woman across the way planted marigolds along her fence. No one would stop her. Across the street, someone had hung a wind chime that clanged softly in the breeze. And on my porch, next to the new mailbox that gleamed like a badge, was the final notice from the county clerk's office confirming that the old HOA had been legally dissolved. I folded the letter once, tucked it into a drawer, and closed it for good.